In the frozen reaches of northern France, where winter seemed eternal and the wind tore through trees like a living thing, the Lemaire house stood as a monument to quiet dread, half buried in snow, half decayed by age and neglect, its timbers groaning under the weight of frost and time. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of the family that lived within, noting with uneasy fascination that every child born to Eloise and Marcel Lemaire arrived only when the frost was deepest, when the sun barely reached the horizon and the earth seemed suspended between death and stillness. Priests muttered warnings in the shadows of the chapel, claiming that the family's children were accompanied by strange omens. Lights flickering through shuttered windows, the sudden chill of a room without fire, the sensation of being watched even when alone. Eloise moved through her home with a calm that bordered on hypnotic, a serene detachment that unsettled even the most confident midwives. Marcel, her husband, remained a figure of measured precision, observing every detail with mechanical intent, his expression never betraying curiosity or affection, only calculation. Each birth was preceded by rituals the villagers could not understand. The cellar heated in a precise rhythm, strange symbols carved into plastered walls and hidden beneath floorboards, and the faint scent of herbs burned in patterns that left a bitter, almost metallic trace in the air. Outsiders who glimpsed the family through frosted windows saw a tidy household, polite manners, the illusion of normal life, but beneath the surface, the Lemaire household functioned as a laboratory of deliberate, methodical cruelty. Every child's first cry carried a peculiar resonance, echoing through the narrow halls in harmonic reflection with the wind outside, as if the house itself had absorbed the new life for purposes known only to the parents. The villagers felt it without understanding. The house breathed around its inhabitants, the walls murmuring secrets and judgments to anyone sensitive enough to hear. And yet the Lemaire family moved within it without apparent fear or hesitation. The children were wrapped in layers of warmth and isolation, watched with quiet intensity, every twitch of muscle and flicker of eyelid noted, catalogued, understood as part of an unspoken plan. Even the servants, careful to obey every order, whispered of a strange atmosphere that pressed upon the lungs and made the heart beat unevenly, as if the house itself demanded compliance and punishment, though invisible, was ever present. In this place, normality was a mask worn over a mind of extraordinary coldness, a mind that treated life as a series of experiments, as data to be tested and observed, as energy to be controlled. The first chapter of the Lemaire story begins here in a house of frost and ritual, in a village that did not know what horror had already taken root, and in the quiet observation of a mother and father whose serene faces hid a meticulously calculated intent, setting the stage for a psychological descent into cruelty that would ripple through the lives of every child born under the unrelenting grip of winter. Dr. Henri Favre had been the village physician for over a decade, yet the Lemaire house drew him into unease that no other home had ever inspired. He noticed the small details that others dismissed, the unnatural symmetry of the cradles in the nursery, the precision with which the children were swaddled, the cold air that clung to the walls long after the hearth had been lit. Henry's visits were ostensibly routine, required by duty, but each step through the frosted hallway brought a tightening in his chest, a sensation that something invisible was watching, calculating, waiting for error. He observed the births from a distance, never fully invited into the rooms where the rituals occurred, yet he could feel their rhythm. The measured movements of Eloise, her serene composure masking an intensity that bordered on obsession. Marcel standing silent, recording details in notebooks that seemed almost scientific in their exactitude. Henri realized that the family treated each child not as a living being, but as a subject in an experiment. The parameters set, the outcomes predicted, the smallest deviations meticulously noted. The children themselves were startlingly quiet, as if conditioned to suppress cries, each facial twitch catalogued, each flinch measured. Henry saw one infant barely hours old react to cold with mechanical precision, shivering exactly as recorded in previous births, as if the patterns of the family had been imprinted before the body had fully formed. Eloise maintained detailed journals of each pregnancy, noting pulse, breath, and temperature with an exactitude that suggested a theory, a hypothesis that Henri could not grasp, and Marcel observed without expression, taking notes, sketching subtle movements, annotating reactions to the cold and the wind that pressed against the house like a living force. Henri began to see patterns he could not rationally explain. The children's behavior mirrored the weather, their cries and movements almost synchronized with gusts of wind, with the creaking of timbers, with the distant tolling of church bells. The family's home had become a place where nature itself seemed subdued to the parents' will. And the physician, who had devoted his life to preserving life, began to question his role, haunted by what he could neither prevent nor fully comprehend. He understood that the children were not merely observed, they were molded, shaped into forms that suited the family's obscure vision, disciplined through a quiet, pervasive pressure that left no room for instinct or resistance. Henri noted the faint, bitter smell of burned herbs that lingered in the nursery, the symbols etched into the walls that seemed to pulse with the family's intent, the precision of every movement, every ritual executed with a calmness that belied the cruelty beneath. And as he departed the house, leaving the family to their work, he felt the weight of silent horror pressing against his shoulders, a premonition that what unfolded within those walls was only the beginning, that the seemingly serene normalcy concealed a methodical mind capable of orchestrating suffering with a precision that no outsider could truly grasp, and that the children, innocent and fragile, were the instruments of a meticulous hidden evil. The wind howled around the Lemaire house like a living thing, rattling shutters and forcing snow through cracks in the ancient wood, yet inside, a cold, deliberate order reigned. The children moved through the halls under careful observation, their every step, glance, and tremor noted with unblinking attention. Eloise moved among them with a grace that was almost spectral, touching their small shoulders, adjusting their blankets, whispering words that sounded soothing yet carried an invisible weight of expectation. Marcel remained ever present in the corners, his notebooks open, his pencil tracing lines, capturing data with the patience of a man studying insects under glass. The air was heavy with herbs burned in precise combinations, a bitter scent that clung to skin and fabric, and Henri Favre, the village physician, could never forget the way it penetrated his lungs, leaving him with a light-headed unease that persisted long after he left. He had begun to understand in the quiet, unnerving hours of observation that the children were not merely being raised but tested, shaped according to some invisible design. Each cry, each shiver, each pulse of breath was measured against an unseen standard, catalogued and compared to the patterns of previous births. Even the seasons seemed to play a part. Winter was not merely a time of birth, but a crucible, and the children's earliest experiences were forged in the frozen air, in the stillness that blanketed the village. Marcel's method was almost surgical in its precision, and Eloise, serene as she appeared, carried a quiet intensity that suggested she understood something beyond the grasp of outsiders, a knowledge that made her movements both tender and terrifying. The cellar had been converted into a chamber of ritual, heated with meticulous care, symbols etched on walls, floors, and beams that seemed to pulse in dim candlelight. Here the family performed ceremonies that were incomprehensible to the village, combining observation, measurement, and an almost spiritual rigor. Henri had once caught a glimpse of a child lying in the cellar, their tiny body exposed to cold in measured intervals, their reaction noted and annotated, the process repeated until the response matched the expectations inscribed in Marcel's careful records. It was not brutality in the conventional sense, but a calculated imposition of forces, cold, light, scent, sound, designed to impress, to shape, to align, each child with some hidden design. The walls themselves seemed alive, the groan of timbers and the shifting of frost communicating something almost sentient. And in those moments Henri realized that the house was more than a home. It was an instrument, a tool of the parents' will, amplifying their meticulous cruelty, bending time, nature, and instinct into a single, precise experiment. Even the servants who obeyed without question sensed the weight of the family's intent. Their careful steps through hallways, their hesitant glances betrayed a fear of unseen consequences, of punishments not always physical but always profound. Outside, the villagers shivered in the endless winter, speaking in whispers of lights flickering through windows, of shadows that moved against the grain of the house, of sounds that carried across snowfields like unnatural echoes of life itself. No one could explain the timing of births, the rituals, the precise order maintained amidst decay and frost. And within the house, as Eloise adjusted a blanket over a sleeping child and Marcel traced a pencil across paper, each breath, each heartbeat, each tiny tremor of muscle was drawn into the vast invisible design of a mind that operated in silence, in secrecy, and in a perfection that left horror lingering in the chest of every observer, a horror that promised only the continuation of control and the quiet shaping of life into forms no outsider could comprehend. The Lemaire house seemed to breathe in time with its occupants, the frost pressing against the windows like a hand, the timbers groaning as if bearing witness to every careful, deliberate act. Eloise moved through the halls with a precision that concealed obsession, her eyes noting the smallest tremor in a child's hand, the faintest shiver that betrayed a body reacting to cold or fear. Marcel followed silently, recording each movement with a pencil that scratched through pages like the echo of a heartbeat, his mind calculating, organizing, predicting. The children's days were mapped with the meticulous regularity of experiments. Feeding, exposure, observation, and rest, all timed to the rhythm of the house, the seasons, and the unseen measures of the parents. Henri Favre had begun to understand that what occurred within those walls was neither ordinary nor accidental. Every element, the chill of the rooms, the placement of objects, the faint scents of burned herbs, the flicker of candlelight, was orchestrated to shape the children's perception of the world, to mold responses with a precision that bordered on the unnatural. Occasionally, a child would cry in a manner that did not align with the established patterns, and Eloise would tilt her head, her serene expression masking a faint tension, while Marcel's pencil paused mid-stroke, as if the anomaly threatened the invisible architecture of their plan. The cellar, warmed with careful attention, became a chamber where observation and ritual intersected, where symbols etched into the walls seemed to pulse with significance only the parents understood. Here, Henri glimpsed processes that defied conventional reasoning. Children exposed to cold or light, reactions carefully measured, annotated, repeated until the response aligned with the parents' expectations. It was not cruelty as others would define it, yet each test left marks, small, almost imperceptible, on the fragile psyches of the young, a shaping of fear and understanding, an imprint that would linger long after the frost had receded. Even the servants, diligent and cautious, could sense the pressure, the invisible command that flowed from the parents' will through every corner of the house. Outside, the village endured winter with its usual hardships, yet whispers traveled through the streets, of lights and windows at impossible hours, of shadows that moved independently of their source, of sounds carried over snow that were not human nor animal, but something that suggested awareness, intent, and an underlying order that made the villagers uneasy. Inside, the children's world was measured in tremors and patterns. A cry might be allowed to continue only until the note harmonized with the wind, a shiver only tolerated until it mirrored the pulse of the house, a glance only observed until it conformed to the invisible expectation of the parents. The Lemaire family treated life itself as data to be collected, analyzed, and controlled, a process conducted with calm detachment, and yet with an intensity that suggested understanding of a truth too dark for outsiders to comprehend. Each child became both witness and subject, their innocence intertwined with the meticulous calculations of their mother and father. Henri understood with a growing weight in his chest that the family's brilliance lay not in care or affection, but in the ability to operate with quiet, methodical efficiency, shaping life according to principles that might be rational to them, horrifying to any observer. And as the snow fell in endless drifts, blanketing the world in silence, the house seemed to absorb it, drawing the cold into its very walls, reflecting it back through every measured breath, every precise movement, every meticulously observed heartbeat, until the boundary between home and instrument, the life and experiment, blurred into a single, deliberate, controlled rhythm, setting a pattern that promised not only continuation but escalation, and leaving anyone who entered the house with the persistent certainty that they had witnessed a mind working in silence, creating a horror hidden beneath the guise of normality, a horror that waited for no one and spared nothing in its quiet pursuit of order. The air inside the Lemaire house carried a chill that seemed to seep into bones, yet it was the stillness that unnerved visitors most. The quiet measured like a pulse, a rhythm that no ordinary home possessed. Eloise moved through rooms with an almost hypnotic grace, adjusting blankets, tilting heads, whispering words that sounded comforting yet pressed invisible expectations onto fragile minds. Marcel remained ever present in the shadows, his pencil moving across pages, capturing the minutest movement, the smallest tremor, the imperceptible flinch that suggested reaction. Each child's day was regimented with clockwork precision, feeding at intervals dictated not by need but by observation. Exposure to cold and light administered in controlled doses. Periods of rest timed to the subtle shifts of the wind outside. Henri Favre, the village physician, had long since stopped trying to rationalize what he saw. He understood that he was witnessing an intelligence at work that treated life itself as material to manipulate, shape, and observe. The children were both subjects and instruments, molded with patience that bordered on the clinical, yet underlaid by a quiet, merciless insistence that they conform to patterns only their parents comprehended. The cellar, the true heart of the house's secret operations, was a chamber of ritual and observation. Symbols etched into the walls, floors, and beams seemed to pulse in dim candlelight, a language whose meaning was unfathomable to outsiders. Children were placed there one at a time, exposed to controlled combinations of light, temperature, and sound, their reactions meticulously recorded. A cry might be allowed to continue only until it resonated with the pattern of a gust of wind outside, a shiver measured against a predetermined interval of exposure, a glance monitored until it aligned with the invisible order the parents imposed. Each repetition left faint but indelible marks on the psyche, shaping perception, response, and instinct, producing a precision of behavior that unnerved even the most rational observer. Henri had once watched as Eloise circled a newborn, noting the angle of limbs, the rise and fall of chest, the tiny movements of fingers and toes, all while Marcel recorded these minute details, his pencil tracing lines that seemed to capture life itself in strokes of graphite. The herbs burned in the chamber produced acrid scents that clung to lungs, skin, and hair, a sensory imprint that Henri would remember for the rest of his life. A subtle coercion whose purpose was as obscure as it was effective. The servants obeyed with careful diligence, their movements cautious, their eyes alert for signs of displeasure. Yet they too were subject to the pervasive weight of the family's control. Outside, winter stretched endlessly over the village, the snowdrifts blanketing streets and fields, but the villagers noticed signs that something unnatural resided within the Lemaire house. Lights flickering at impossible hours, shadows moving against the rhythm of the household, sounds that carried over the cold with an echo too precise to be random. Within, the children's first truly formative terror occurred. Eloise directed one child into the cellar alone, the small body trembling under the measured cold, the child's cries harmonizing unnaturally with the wind. Marcel noted every response with mechanical calm, recording duration of vocalization, body tension, and minute fluctuations in skin temperature. The child's instinctive fear was not soothed but catalogued, repeated until the reaction matched the expected parameters. Henri realized in a cold, sickening clarity that the parents were not merely guiding life. They were engineering it, bending instinct and emotion into forms dictated by some hidden purpose. Each ritual, each measured exposure was a lesson in obedience, control, and fear, conducted with the calmness of someone performing laboratory work. yet with the intent to imprint upon the fragile mind a pattern that would endure long after childhood. Even the walls seemed complicit, groaning with age, yet absorbing and reflecting every movement, every shiver, every breath, turning the house itself into a participant, amplifying the parents' will. And so the Lemaire children, innocent and fragile, were drawn into a reality governed not by nurture but by calculated, methodical shaping, their lives mapped, measured, and controlled with a precision that horrified anyone who perceived it. Henri, leaving the house after one such observation, felt the weight of that quiet, hidden horror pressing against his chest. A certainty that the mind behind the family's calm, polite exterior was capable of orchestrating suffering and shaping life with a clarity and detachment that defied comprehension, and that the cycle had only just begun, promising escalation, deepening cruelty, and a precision of method that would haunt him and the village for years to come. The village spoke in whispers, hushed tones that carried across snow-covered streets, of the strange rhythms that emanated from the Lemaire house. No one dared enter uninvited, yet all were aware of the precise order of births, the cold regularity with which new life arrived each winter, and the subtle, almost imperceptible signals of control that seemed to permeate every action within those walls. Eloise moved among her children with a calm intensity that suggested knowledge beyond human understanding. Her hands adjusting blankets, tilting heads, brushing hair, all with the care of someone performing a sacred task. And yet beneath that grace lay a calculated intent, a manipulation that shaped both body and mind. Marcel observed from the corners, pencil tracing lines, noting reactions, calibrating patterns, his mind a precise instrument designed to convert the unpredictable chaos of life into data, into control. The children were no longer simply being raised. They were being measured, modeled, and molded according to invisible, rigid criteria. Henri Favre had come to understand the full extent of the psychological weight imposed upon them. Every cry, every shiver, every blink and breath was not just recorded, but analyzed, compared, and repeated until it fit the parents' exacting design. Even the flicker of a candle, the angle of sunlight on a wall, the faintest scent of herbs burned in calculated sequences were used to shape perception, instill patterns, and train instinct. The cellar had become a chamber of extremes where the children were exposed to cold, light, and sound in measured doses, reactions meticulously logged and repeated until responses aligned perfectly with expectations. One child, left alone for intervals of increasing duration, cried until the sound harmonized with the wind outside, a symphony of fear and observation conducted under calm, methodical supervision. Henri felt an unease that went beyond comprehension, a recognition that the Lemaire household operated under a logic alien to ordinary morality, a logic in which life itself was raw material for control and precision. Servants moved with care, aware of invisible rules, and the house itself seemed to respond to the will of its occupants, amplifying both the chill and the pressure, reflecting each carefully measured breath and movement back into the rhythm of the home. Outside, villagers spoke of lights moving unnaturally through windows, shadows that did not belong to any figure, and sounds that carried over frozen fields in patterns too exact to be coincidence. Inside, the children began to internalize the pattern, instinctively understanding the boundaries, the rhythms, the unspoken rules, yet unaware of the full extent of the invisible design that governed them. The Lemaire family's control was subtle, comprehensive, and complete. Each moment of observation, each ritualized exposure was a step in the shaping of minds and bodies, a quiet orchestration of life according to principles known only to the parents. The horror was not loud. It was measured, systematic, and silent, yet it left an indelible mark on those who witnessed it, a creeping understanding that the family's methodical cruelty was ongoing, precise, and far from finished, a silent mastery over life itself carried out under the guise of normality, leaving the village with a lingering fear that they could never fully understand, and that the rhythm of winter births, the quiet precision, and the hidden rituals would continue, imperceptible, unstoppable, and always calculated. The cellar had become the true heart of the Lemaire family's hidden design, a place where the ordinary rhythms of childhood were replaced with something precise, ritualized, and almost surgical in its execution. Candlelight flickered across walls marked with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly under Henri Favre's watchful eyes, a language of intent that he could not interpret yet felt deep in his chest. Eloise guided one of the younger children into the chamber, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if performing a rite known only to her and the house itself. Marcel followed, pencil poised over pages recording minute variations in posture, tension, and respiration, the data accumulating into patterns that Henri could not reconcile with any known moral framework. The child shivered against the cold, its first instinctive cries rising in pitch and volume. Yet Eloise allowed them to continue, observing the responses as she adjusted blankets, nudged limbs, and murmured words that carried authority beyond comfort. Slowly, Henri realized that the cries were not being soothed, but calibrated, measured against the flicker of candlelight and the rhythmic shift of the wind outside, until the sound itself fell into alignment with some invisible metric known only to the parents. The herbs burned at the far end of the cellar produced scents that clung to the air, acrid and sweet at once, a chemical memory designed to imprint subtly on the child's senses, reinforcing the lesson being taught. Obedience, endurance, and the internalization of fear. The process was neither hasty nor chaotic. It was deliberate, patient, and inhuman in its precision. Each interval of exposure was increased, each cry allowed to evolve, each shiver measured against a standard that Henri could not name. Yet he felt the weight of it pressing against his mind. Outside, the wind howled against the frozen landscape, carrying a resonance that seemed to echo inside the walls, amplifying the effect of the ritual, drawing the child's instinctive terror into harmony with forces beyond comprehension. Henri noticed the faintest details, the angle of a head, the tightening of a jaw, the subtle shift of toes, and understood that every tiny reaction was being logged, understood, and repeated until it conformed. In one particularly harrowing moment, Eloise directed the child to reach for a small object placed in the center of the room, a task simple in appearance yet fraught with tension, requiring coordination under measured exposure to cold, light, and sensory disorientation. The child's hesitation, the tremor in the hands, the rising pitch of the whimper, all were noted, processed, and integrated into the ongoing structure of learning. Marcel adjusted the interval of exposure based on minute differences in the child's reaction, calculating the precise moment when fear transformed into compliance, a transformation invisible to any observer untrained in the parent's system. Henri, compelled to watch yet horrified beyond words, recognized that what he was witnessing was a form of control beyond ordinary cruelty. A meticulous shaping of instinct, perception, and emotion conducted with a calm detachment that made the ritual profoundly disturbing. The cellar itself seemed alive, responding to the movements, the sounds, and the intentions, the walls absorbing each detail, the shadows reflecting the quiet, obsessive intelligence at work. By the time the child left the chamber, small, trembling yet perfectly aligned with the invisible patterns imposed upon it, Henri understood the full weight of the Lemaire method. Life shaped and ordered according to precise design. Cruelty administered with surgical care, and a mind operating in silence, orchestrating horrors that were invisible yet indelible, leaving no outward trace yet imprinting upon the soul in ways impossible to undo. The villagers' whispers, the frozen winds, the precise winter births, all were part of a rhythm that no outsider could truly see. Yet all who glimpsed it felt the cold certainty of a calculated, relentless, and deeply methodical evil. The children began to move through the house with a quiet awareness that was unsettling to any observer, a precision that hinted at lessons far beyond ordinary discipline. Each step, each glance, each tilt of the head had been subtly calibrated by Eloise and Marcel, internalized through repeated exposure to the cellar's measured extremes. Outside, winter pressed on the village with unyielding weight, yet within the house a different kind of cold had taken root, an emotional, psychological frost that shaped instinct and response. The youngest, barely able to walk, would pause at thresholds, hands hovering over doors, sensing the invisible lines of authority and adjusting posture to fit the silent rules. They carried the weight of observation even when alone, moving as though the house itself demanded conformity, the rituals having imprinted a rhythm into every nerve and thought. Henri Favre watched, heart heavy as the oldest child guided the youngest through tasks, teaching imitation of precise movements, measured reactions, and controlled expressions. The knowledge passed not through speech but through quiet modeling. Eloise moved among them with serene authority, her presence both comforting and coercive, ensuring the invisible order persisted without question. Marcel recorded every detail, his eyes scanning, measuring, noting minute deviations, converting instinct into data, control into pattern. Even the air seemed manipulated, the smell of herbs, the temperature of rooms, the flicker of candlelight, all contributing to a sensory map that conditioned the children's responses. Fear was not eradicated but harnessed, aligned with expectation, made to feel natural rather than imposed. Each small success, each subtle compliance reinforced the invisible rules, shaping thought and movement alike. Villagers passing the house felt the effect without understanding its source. A quiet, unnatural order in the way lights moved, shadows lingered, and the wind carried a pattern over the frozen landscape. The Lemaire children had become instruments of the house itself, their behavior a reflection of meticulous shaping that blurred the line between life and experiment. Henri, stepping back into the snow, could not shake the certainty that the family's calm, polite exterior masked a mind of profound calculation, orchestrating lives with an invisible hand, imposing a discipline that would endure far beyond childhood. The horror of understanding this was not immediate or loud. It was quiet, persistent, and pervasive, like frost creeping through walls. The children's innocence was preserved only in appearance. Beneath it lay a precision forged in ritual, observation, and subtle coercion, a shaping of instinct and fear that left nothing untouched. And in the silence that followed, the wind outside carried the echo of this hidden order, a reminder to all who witnessed it that methodical evil can hide behind the softest of exteriors, shaping life in ways invisible, relentless, and irreversible. The village began to notice subtle changes in the children, small details that suggested something beyond ordinary upbringing. Faces that should have been soft with innocence instead held the faintest shadow of calculation. Eyes that measured and observed before acting. Voices that paused in hesitation as if sensing invisible boundaries. Even the way they played carried structure. Movements repeated in patterns, laughter timed and measured, reactions aligned with lessons learned in the cold, candlelit cellar. Henri Favre observed one of the older children guiding a younger through a simple task, stacking firewood. But the precision was unnerving, the teaching methodical, almost clinical, with the older child correcting posture, grip, and timing as if enforcing a silent code. Eloise moved silently nearby, her presence calm, unthreatening to the untrained eye, yet every gesture she made seemed to amplify the invisible order, each movement shaping thought and reaction without overt instruction. Marcel's meticulous records captured it all, the pages filled with notations, symbols, and patterns that would have made no sense to anyone else, yet mapped every instinct, every pause, every tremor in the children's muscles. The smell of burned herbs lingered in the air, faintly sweet, oddly metallic, forming a memory that tied obedience and fear together in subtle, untraceable ways. Henry felt a creeping dread as he realized that the children were learning not just to respond, but to anticipate, to preempt, to internalize a rhythm of fear and compliance that had been impressed upon them before they had any choice. Even the smallest deviations were corrected silently. A hand on a shoulder, a tilt of the head, a pause that enforced alignment with the invisible rules. Outside, villagers shivered as they passed the house, sensing an unnatural stillness, the absence of ordinary disorder, a quiet vigilance that could not be explained. Snow fell relentlessly, but the real cold was inside, a psychological frost that the Lemaire parents had cultivated deliberately. The horror was slow, imperceptible to most, but Henri felt it in every measured movement, every hesitant glance, every obedient whisper. The children were both alive and instruments, their humanity subtly, systematically shaped into a reflection of the parents' meticulous design. It was not overt cruelty, not yet, but the foundations of a lifetime's control were being laid with methodical care, in silence, with an almost sacred patience. The wind outside carried a hollow echo, faint but insistent, of the unnatural order within, a rhythm only the house and its occupants fully understood, a warning that methodical evil does not need spectacle to root itself deeply, and that the shaping of minds can be as terrifying as the shaping of flesh. The cellar became the stage for lessons that were invisible to the casual observer but indelibly etched into the minds of the children. One by one they were brought down to the dim light, the cold stone floor pressing through thin clothing, the scent of herbs clinging to the air, a subtle warning woven into every breath. Eloise guided each child with the precision of a scholar, adjusting posture, tilting heads, ensuring that every reaction conformed to her quiet, unyielding design. Marcel followed behind, pencil scratching pages, recording microseconds of hesitation, the faintest quiver in fingers or toes, the rhythm of a heartbeat under measured stress. The children's cries were not silenced, they were orchestrated, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost musical, yet carried the weight of fear and obedience intertwined. Henri Favre watched, stomach tight, as the oldest child, no more than 8, was instructed to carry a small vessel of water across the cold stone floor, stopping at intervals precisely determined by Eloise. At each stop, the child's hands were held steady, the tilt of the head adjusted, until the motion of walking, of lifting, of breathing, aligned perfectly with the invisible measure of control. The smallest deviation, a tremor in a limb, a stammer in a step, was noted, recorded, and corrected with patient, silent repetition. The herbs burned in the corner, acrid and sweet, left a memory in the children's senses, a connection between discomfort and obedience that could not easily be shaken. The youngest, watching from the shadows, began to anticipate the lessons, adjusting posture, holding breath, aligning movements before any command was given, absorbing the pattern as if born to it. Outside, the wind cut across the frozen fields, carrying the faintest echoes of the children's ritualized cries, a chorus in harmony with the relentless rhythm of winter. Henri realized that the horror of this household was not the visible cruelty, but the invisible one, control layered upon instinct, shaping thought and reaction before the child could understand choice. The house itself seemed to participate, amplifying sound, reflecting light, intensifying cold, making the environment a co-conspirator in the methodical shaping of life. Each child emerged from the cellar changed, not just tired or frightened, but aligned, calibrated, their instincts molded to fit a rhythm known only to the parents. In the quiet that followed, the Lemaire house settled into its frozen order, the wind outside whispering against walls that had absorbed every detail, every reaction, every trace of fear. Henri, stepping back into the snow-covered night, understood that this pattern would repeat, escalating in both subtlety and intensity until the children were instruments perfectly tuned to the silent, unyielding logic of their parents' design. The calm exterior of the family concealed horrors that were precise, hidden, and enduring, a slow, relentless shaping of life itself under the guise of normality, leaving only whispers in the village and a lingering sense that methodical evil was at work in silence, its full measure impossible to gauge until it had already claimed its mark. As winter deepened, the rituals became more elaborate, the measures of control more precise, the psychological grip on the children tightening like a coil around the soul. Eloise moved through the house with the serene authority of someone who had spent years perfecting a system no outsider could perceive. Her every gesture weighted with the silent insistence of obedience. Marcel's meticulous notes chronicled every reaction, every pause, every subtle tremor in posture, mapping instinct into patterns that could be repeated, predicted, and manipulated at will. The cellar was no longer merely a place of observation. It had become a laboratory, a chamber where life itself was measured, adjusted, and refined according to invisible metrics known only to the parents. Candles flickered against walls lined with symbols whose meaning was indecipherable to Henri Favre, yet he felt their power pressing against his consciousness, a subtle language of command that shaped thought and fear without overt words. Children were brought to the chamber not just for observation but for active participation in exercises designed to align instinct with expectation. They were required to carry objects across the stone floor, to replicate gestures in exact sequence, to modulate breathing and heartbeat under controlled stress, all while the scent of burned herbs filled the air, weaving compliance into memory through chemical suggestion. The oldest children guided the youngest, teaching imitation not as play but as adherence, transmitting a silent code through careful demonstration. Henri noticed the youngest child, barely 5, trembling as the ritual began, yet moving with a precision that should have been impossible at such an age, instinctively following the pattern established by repetition, fear, and subtle coercion. At intervals, Eloise would pause the exercise, tilting a head, adjusting a wrist, correcting a gaze until the child's movements became synchronous with the rhythm of the ritual itself. Marcel recorded every nuance, the scratch of pencil on paper capturing microseconds of hesitation, the tilt of shoulders, the pulse of terror converted into data. Outside, the snow pressed against the house, the wind howling in harmony with the children's cries, echoing the ritual's cadence across frozen fields. Henri understood the depth of the horror not in overt violence, but in the invisible shaping of life. A meticulous, relentless alignment of instinct and fear conducted under the guise of domestic normalcy. One particular exercise escalated into something uniquely horrifying. A pattern of exposure to cold, sound, and sensory disorientation so precise that the children's reactions were reshaped, not merely observed, creating a form of compliance that was almost preternatural in its perfection. Each child emerged from the cellar changed, their instincts calibrated, their humanity subtly bent to the will of the parents, the process leaving no visible mark but imprinting on memory, movement, and thought. Henri felt the oppressive weight of understanding that this methodical evil, hidden behind polite manners and domestic routine, had already begun to claim its victims in ways the village could neither see nor comprehend. The house, the parents, and the rituals had created a new order, one that extended beyond fear into the quiet, relentless shaping of life itself. The winter wind whispered through the frozen landscape, carrying with it the echo of cries, the resonance of compliance, and the chilling certainty that the Lemaire family's influence was absolute, invisible, and terrifying in its enduring precision. The children's routines began to take on a rhythm that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. A silent choreography dictated entirely by the Lemaire parents. Each day was structured around imperceptible cues, the flicker of candlelight, the shifting of shadows, the faint aroma of burned herbs that seemed to hover in every corner, signaling not punishment or reward, but expectation itself. Henri Favre observed as the youngest, no more than 5, paused mid-step when a shadow fell across the floor, instinctively lowering shoulders and adjusting gaze, the motion precise as if rehearsed 1,000 times. Eloise moved among them with unassuming grace, guiding without touch, teaching without speaking. her serene authority embedding itself into thought, perception, and reaction. Marcel documented every moment, his records dense with cryptic symbols, exact measurements, and notations of micro-expressions that would have seemed meaningless to any outsider but formed a detailed map of control. The children's laughter, when it came, was measured, their play a series of rehearsed motions that reflected an understanding beyond their age. An alignment of instinct with expectation that Henri found impossible to watch without a chill settling deep in his chest. There were moments when fear rose like a tide, when hesitation flickered across a small face, only for Eloise's calm correction to absorb it entirely, transforming instinct into compliance so subtly that the child might not have recognized it as fear at all. Even sleep was regimented. The smallest movements in bed were noted and adjusted through gentle guidance, the air itself carrying the cues of ritual, shaping dreams, reactions, and thought. Outside, winter pressed relentlessly against the house, the snow muffling sound yet amplifying the silence of the interior. The unnatural order within resonating against the frozen walls. Henri realized that the horror of the Lemaire household was not in acts of overt cruelty, but in the invisible, systematic shaping of life itself. Each child molded into a vessel of obedience and anticipation, conditioned to predict and conform before understanding. A quiet horror that left no outward scars but rewrote instinct, emotion, and will. The house seemed alive, a participant in the methodical cruelty, its creaking floors, drafty corners, and shadowed angles reinforcing the rhythm of ritual. Every gust of wind echoing the pattern of control. By the end of each day, the children's movements, expressions, and even breath seemed synchronized with the invisible hand of their parents' design, a chilling testament to a power that was patient, precise, and terrifying in its silent endurance. Henri could only shiver in the snow outside, understanding that this was not momentary terror but a permanent recalibration of life itself. A hidden, relentless evil that had already claimed its mark in ways the village could neither see nor comprehend. The first true ritual of horror was subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone outside the house, yet it carried a precision that left no room for deviation. Eloise arranged the children in a circle in the cellar, each small body positioned with care. Limbs aligned as though part of a measured design, their eyes wide but obedient, absorbing the invisible logic that permeated the room. Marcel moved among them, recording posture, pulse, and eye movement, marking symbols that Henri could not interpret but sensed, held the weight of calculation and intent. The ritual began with the burning of a rare herb, the smoke curling upward in a thin, metallic scent that seemed to thread itself into memory, binding attention and emotion together in a single, unbroken pattern. The children's first task was to carry a small vessel of water from one end of the cellar to the other. But this was no ordinary exercise. The floor was slick with a thin layer of ice, the candlelight positioned to cast shadows that created the illusion of obstacles. And at precisely timed intervals, Eloise would lift her hand or tilt her head, triggering a prearranged motion the children had been conditioned to anticipate. Every hesitation was corrected instantly, a small touch here, a tilt there, a whispered command embedded in breath alone. Henri felt his stomach tighten as he realized that the children were not simply performing a task. They were performing themselves, becoming extensions of the ritual, bodies and minds reshaped to fit a silent, terrifying order. The older children guided the younger ones, teaching imitation not as play but as enforcement, transmitting control across ages, ensuring that the smallest child understood the code without understanding it consciously. The cries that escaped were not of pain but of anticipation, measured and aligned to the rhythm of the ritual, echoing faintly against stone walls that seemed to absorb and amplify them. Outside, the wind howled across frozen fields, but inside, the cellar held a different current, a pulse of precision and quiet terror that was almost alive. The children emerged from the exercise altered, their movements more synchronized, their instincts aligned with the invisible metrics of their parents' will, the fear internalized into thought and motion. Henry, standing in shadow, could see the depth of what had been done. Not mere discipline or punishment, but a methodical re-engineering of life itself, shaping obedience and anticipation into instruments of subtle terror. Every glance, every step, every breath had been recalibrated, and he understood that this was only the beginning. The house exhaled a cold, silent satisfaction, the shadows moving with the children, binding them to rhythms they could not name. And Henri felt the oppressive certainty that the Lemaire family's influence was absolute, hidden in plain sight, precise and enduring. The real horror, he realized, was not spectacle but subtlety, a slow, deliberate domination of mind and body that left no outward scars but created victims who were unknowingly complicit in their own shaping. The wind outside carried a faint echo of their alignment, a resonance of fear and obedience interwoven into the very fabric of the house, a warning that some evils operate best in silence, hidden beneath ordinary faces, ordinary routines, and ordinary kindnesses. As the winter deepened, the rituals escalated in subtlety and intensity, each day layering control over instinct until the children's minds moved almost as extensions of the Lemaire parents' design. The cellar became a crucible of silent instruction, where light, shadow, and the faint lingering aroma of burned herbs guided thought as much as fear. Eloise moved among the children with the calm of someone who had measured every breath, every heartbeat, every flutter of eyelid against centuries of expectation and human instinct. Her touch, when it came, was minimal, sometimes a hand resting briefly on a shoulder, a tilt of the head. But its effect was total, recalibrating posture, movement, even the rhythm of breathing, as if she were tuning instruments rather than guiding human children. Marcel recorded each detail with an obsessive diligence that bordered on mania, his pencil scratching across pages in precise notation of microseconds of hesitation, subtle tremors and fleeting expressions that no one outside would notice, but that revealed everything about obedience, fear, and compliance. The children had begun to anticipate commands before they were given, adjusting their movements and posture instinctively, a preemptive obedience that Henri realized was more terrifying than overt cruelty. The older children enforced the pattern, guiding the younger ones without cruelty, without malice, merely transmitting the rhythm of compliance that had been drilled into them since birth, a living system of internalized control that ensured the cycle of conditioning could continue even when the parents were absent. The most chilling exercise involved a sequence of sensory distortions, Cold drafts directed along narrow corridors, faint sounds amplified and echoed from hidden corners, and the timed release of herbal smoke. Each element designed to create a tension that heightened perception while simultaneously bending it to a predetermined rhythm. The children moved through the sequence with a precision that Henri could scarcely believe. Their bodies tuned to invisible signals, their instinctive reactions aligned with the expectations of their parents' methodical cruelty. There were no overt punishments, no visible scars, yet Henri could see the profound internalization of fear, the subtle calibration of thought, perception, and motion that left the children already shaped in ways they could not articulate. Outside, the winter wind cut across the village, but inside, the cellar hummed with the quiet pulse of alignment, a rhythm that bound life itself to a hidden, almost imperceptible authority. Henri felt the depth of horror that lay not in the ritual's spectacle, but in its invisible, enduring precision. The children's laughter had become muted, their play calculated, each glance and gesture measured against an unspoken standard, internalized before it could be questioned. Each day ended with a sense of exhausted perfection, the cellar emptied, shadows lengthening, and the house itself seeming to breathe with satisfaction at the order it had imposed. Henri understood with a chilling certainty that this was not a momentary form of terror, but a permanent reshaping of life, an internalized obedience so complete that the children could not recognize its origin. The Lemaire family had created something more than control. They had created alignment, a silent, methodical calibration of instinct, thought, and fear, executed with such precision that the village would never see its full measure. The true horror, Henri realized, was the subtlety, the invisibility, the patient patience of a mind that orchestrates life itself from behind the calm mask of domestic normalcy, leaving victims who could not name their own submission but were already bound to it completely. The next stage of the Lemaire family's design was both physical and psychological, a step beyond invisible shaping into a ritualized orchestration of body and mind that left no mark but carved deep, lasting impressions into the children's very instincts. The cellar, already a chamber of quiet terror and meticulous alignment, became a stage for exercises that tested endurance, perception, and obedience simultaneously. Eloise instructed the children to navigate narrow paths traced in frost and candlelight, their tiny feet barely making sound on the stone, yet every movement recorded by Marcel with obsessive precision. At intervals, she introduced sudden disruptions, a gust of wind funneled through a hidden vent, a clatter of iron dropped unseen, a flicker of candlelight across a symbol etched into the wall. Each disruption required instantaneous correction, a recalibration that bound reaction to anticipation, instinct to instruction, creating an internal rhythm that the children absorbed without question. The older children led the younger ones through these trials, demonstrating movements with careful attention, teaching imitation not as play but as survival, ensuring that even the smallest child could perform without error, instinctively correcting any deviation before it occurred. The smells of herbs burned in precise combinations filled the air, each aroma chosen to trigger subtle emotional responses: calm, fear, anticipation, obedience. The children's internal states were being mapped, manipulated, and molded, a quiet and precise domination of thought and emotion that left no visible scars but reshaped their very selves. Henri, watching in the shadows, felt the oppressive weight of understanding that this was not a game, not punishment, not even education, but a deliberate reconstruction of life according to a system of methodical cruelty that only the Lemaire parents understood. In one particularly harrowing exercise, the children were asked to carry small vessels of water along paths lined with ice and uneven stone, guided by flickering candlelight and the ever-present scent of burning herbs. A misstep, hesitation, or misplaced glance triggered correction. A hand on the shoulder, a tilt of the head, a soft, commanding breath. And the child's posture, movement, and focus were instantly realigned. The repetition of these exercises created a precision and instinct that seemed preternatural. An eerie synchronicity among the children, as if they were extensions of the house itself, their movements in harmony with the silent logic that governed the rituals. There were moments when fear rose sharply, a tremor in a tiny shoulder or a flicker in an eye, yet Eloise's serene presence absorbed it, converting it into compliance without overt threat. Marcel documented every nuance, noting how microseconds of hesitation decreased with repetition, how instinct became anticipation, how thought itself bent to expectation before it could form. Henri felt the unbearable weight of recognition. The children were no longer simply performing. They had internalized the pattern, carrying the silent, calculated authority of the Lemaire household within themselves. Each night, as they returned to their beds, their tiny bodies exhausted and perfectly aligned, the house seemed to exhale a quiet satisfaction, its walls absorbing the echoes of ritual, the rhythm of fear, and the pulse of obedience. The horror was complete not in spectacle but in subtlety, a slow, relentless shaping of life itself, leaving victims who could not name their submission, who could not recall a time before their instincts had been remolded, yet who carried within them the chilling signature of the Lemaire method, patient, precise, and terrifyingly permanent. Outside, the wind howled across frozen fields, but within, silence held a measure of control that was absolute, invisible, and enduring, leaving Henri with the inescapable certainty that this hidden evil was perfected in plain sight, a calm face concealing methodical, almost scientific horror, a power that bent life itself without leaving a single outward scar. As winter reached its deepest chill, the Lemaire rituals evolved into something far more deliberate, a combination of physical endurance, psychological conditioning, and a uniquely crafted horror that left permanent impressions on the children's minds. The cellar, already a chamber of invisible terror, became the epicenter of methodical cruelty, where every shadow, flicker of candlelight, and curl of herb smoke was designed to calibrate fear, obedience, and instinct simultaneously. Eloise directed the children to participate in a sequence she called the alignment, a meticulously timed series of movements that combined balance, coordination, and psychological endurance, yet was delivered with the calm serenity of someone performing ordinary domestic duties. The floor was marked with symbols etched faintly into the stone, arcs and angles that guided the children's paths. Each step measured, each pause monitored. Marcel recorded everything with obsessive diligence, noting the precise timing of microseconds between motions, slight hesitations, and subtle changes in breathing or posture. The ritual began with the smallest children carrying delicate vessels of water along narrow, icy paths, while older siblings and parents observed, noting reactions, posture, and instinctive responses. As the children moved, Eloise introduced unpredictable sensory elements. A sudden gust of cold air funneled from a hidden vent. The metallic clatter of iron dropped out of sight, and the strategic flicker of candlelight across symbols etched in the walls. Each disruption required instantaneous correction, each instinct bent to anticipation, each reaction absorbed and processed into the silent curriculum of control. Yet this was only the surface, a preparation for a more profound, uniquely terrifying exercise that would imprint itself permanently. At the climax of the alignment, Eloise instructed the children to step into shallow basins of ice water, their tiny limbs trembling but bodies rigid with anticipation. The water was frigid, yet it was not the cold itself that was the test. It was the integration of sensation, anticipation, and compliance under physical duress. The children's task was to carry a small candle through a narrow corridor, balancing it carefully while maintaining posture, alignment, and silent attention to invisible cues from their parents. Any hesitation, flicker of movement, or shift in gaze was immediately corrected by a gentle touch or subtle tilt, a method so precise that it reshaped instinct before fear could assert itself. Henri observed in horror as the children moved, each step a testament to the terrifying power of subtle, methodical conditioning. Their small bodies bore no outward marks of punishment, yet their minds had been recalibrated, their instincts aligned to a rhythm they could not name. It was a choreography of control, a quiet orchestration of terror that left permanent echoes in the nervous system, the kind of horror that could not be erased or forgotten. The ritual's final stage introduced a uniquely cruel psychological element. Eloise presented the children with mirrors, reflecting their own faces back at them, yet arranged so that the mirrors were slightly angled, their reflections distorted, multiplied, and fractured. The children were forced to navigate the corridor once more, balancing the candle, but this time responding not only to the physical challenges but also to the disorienting alien reflections of themselves. The experience created a cognitive dissonance, a sense of disconnection from their own bodies and identities which Eloise measured with quiet satisfaction. Marcel noted subtle shifts in micro-expressions, in posture, in instinctive correction of movement, documenting the success of the psychological integration. Henri realized with mounting dread that the children were being taught to internalize external authority as part of themselves, aligning fear and obedience into their very perception of self. The ritual was over in appearance, yet its effects endured, permanent and invisible, reshaping identity, perception, and instinct simultaneously. Outside, the winter wind cut across the barren village, but within the Lemaire house, silence held like a living entity. The children rested, exhausted, perfectly aligned in posture and thought, carrying the invisible imprint of ritualized horror. The house itself seemed to exhale a quiet satisfaction, absorbing the echoes of ceremony, anticipation, and fear, its walls impregnated with the methodical cruelty of the parents' design. Henri understood that this was more than subtlety or control. It was the creation of permanent compliance, a shaping of life itself that left no scars but bound instinct, thought, and identity to the will of Eloise and Marcel. The true terror lay not in spectacle but in precision, in the slow, deliberate creation of instruments of silent obedience, victims who could not name their submission yet bore it completely within themselves. The Lemaire family's work was complete for now, and in its quiet, controlled perfection, it demonstrated that evil often operates in silence, masked by normalcy, meticulously hidden, yet enduring in its consequences. By the turn of the new year, the Lemaire household had reached a terrifying stage of refinement. The children, now months into their silent conditioning, displayed a precision of movement, thought, and instinct that Henri could barely comprehend. Each action was measured, each glance intentional. Yet all were guided by an internalized authority no one could see. Eloise's calm had never faltered. She moved through the house like a conductor guiding an orchestra of shadows, each child a note perfectly placed in a symphony of obedience. Marcel, always at her side, recorded every movement, every subtle tremor of thought, and every micro-expression with a meticulous attention that suggested both mania and genius. In the cellar, the alignment had become ritualized to an almost religious level. Children navigated corridors of frost and candlelight, balancing vessels of water or carrying fragile candles, their reflexes tuned to anticipation of disruption rather than reaction to it. Gusts of cold, flickering shadows and the faint scent of burned herbs created an environment of controlled chaos, designed not to punish but to perfect instinct. Henri observed as even the youngest, barely able to walk without support, moved with uncanny accuracy, correcting missteps before they happened, responding to invisible cues that had been drilled into them since birth. It was terrifying in its perfection, a silent horror that left no bruises but etched obedience into every fiber of their being. The next phase was far more invasive, both physically and psychologically. Eloise began what she called the reflection exercises, a series of tests that forced the children to confront themselves, their bodies, and their instincts in ways that were subtly cruel and deeply formative. Mirrors were placed along narrow corridors, angled to fragment and distort images. Children were required to carry candles or vessels of water along these paths, adjusting movement, posture, and timing to the shifting reflections that multiplied and fractured their sense of self. The exercises created dissonance, a quiet horror that distorted perception and forced internalization of external authority. Any hesitation was corrected, not with violence, but with precise, almost surgical guidance. A hand on a shoulder, a tilt of the head, a quiet, controlling breath. Each child learned to align instinct with anticipation, fear with obedience, body with mind. Marcel meticulously documented responses, noting how repeated exposure hardened instinct, reshaped perception, and erased any trace of spontaneous thought. Henri felt the depth of horror in realizing that the children's identities were no longer separate. They were extensions of the Lemaire household, instruments of silent precision. In a final and uniquely devastating exercise, the children were exposed to their first real test of consequence. Eloise instructed them to navigate the cellar carrying a fragile, ice-cold vessel of water while avoiding a series of hidden disruptions. A sudden gust of wind, a flicker of candlelight across etched symbols, and the muffled clatter of iron on stone. The youngest faltered, misjudging the icy path, and the vessel tipped, spilling water over cold stone. Henri braced for a reaction of anger, punishment, or distress, but Eloise's response was far more chilling. She simply instructed the child to start again, her calm unwavering, yet every subtle gesture, the slightest tilt of her hand, the shift of her gaze, conveyed correction, instruction, and consequence more effective than any overt violence. The child corrected instinctively, internalizing failure as an integral part of obedience, understanding error as something to be anticipated and erased before it could manifest. Marcel noted each adjustment with meticulous care, recording the development of instinctive correction, the deep embedding of anticipation over reaction. The exercise left no visible scars, but Henri could see that the psychological imprint was permanent, a reshaping of identity that would last a lifetime. Outside the house, the village began to stir with whispers. Children's births remained cloaked in winter, their health and growth peculiar. Yet villagers could not articulate the depth of abnormality they sensed. Priests whispered of strange omens, unusual harmonies and cries, and the unnerving serenity of the Lemaire matriarch. Few dared approach, and those who did reported an unspoken tension, a quiet alignment in the household that made ordinary life seem fragile by comparison. Henri understood as he watched from the shadows that the Lemaire family had created more than obedience or ritual. They had created a system of control so precise that it bent instinct, thought, and identity into invisible compliance. The horror was not in spectacle or punishment, but in the methodical shaping of life itself. The quiet imposition of authority internalized to the point that victims could not recognize it. The children carried the imprint of ritual in every gesture, every reflex, every breath, and the village remained oblivious to the true nature of the evil that had settled in plain sight. The house exhaled with satisfaction, absorbing echoes of ritual, anticipation, and silent fear, as if it were a living entity bound to the will of Eloise and Marcel. Henri knew with certainty that the invisible imprint of the Lemaire household would endure, shaping life long after the winter snows melted, a terrifying demonstration of how evil operates in calm, patient silence, methodical and enduring, hidden behind the mask of domestic normalcy. The first hints of outside attention came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Villagers noticed the pattern, the strange alignment of events. The births that always occurred when snow blanketed the village, as though the Lemaire family had synchronized life itself with the frozen season. Travelers passing the old house remarked on the stillness, the eerie tidiness that clashed with the decaying structure, and the faint smell of herbs burning without explanation. Priests whispered warnings, concerned by the odd rituals they glimpsed through half-closed windows, but no one dared confront the family directly. The children moved with an unnatural precision, their small bodies and faces betraying no fatigue, their eyes reflecting both fear and understanding beyond their years. Henri observed silently, horrified by the realization that these impressions were not mere obedience. They were a permanent restructuring of perception and instinct, a psychological map of control drawn with terrifying care. A local midwife, compelled by curiosity and unease, approached the house under the pretense of delivering supplies. She noticed the faint symbols etched in the cellar doorway. The unusual arrangement of candles and the silent, watchful gaze of the children. She sensed something profoundly wrong, a rhythm that was invisible but palpable, a terror that did not announce itself with noise or violence but whispered its presence in subtle alignment and anticipation. When she returned to the village, her accounts were fragmented and uneasy, almost incoherent to those who had not witnessed the quiet orchestration of control. Villagers nodded politely but dismissed her warnings. The Lemaire household maintained the perfect mask of domestic normalcy, polite, calm, and meticulous in every detail. Even as curiosity grew, the family's methodical cruelty remained hidden, impossible to articulate to outsiders. The horrors inside were invisible, absorbed into the very instincts of the children, shaping thought and reflex, leaving no trace that could be conveyed in words. And so, the Lemaire house continued its silent work, cultivating fear, obedience, and alignment in ways that the world outside could neither see nor understand, its methodical terror thriving in plain sight. The first hints of outside attention came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Villagers noticed the pattern, the strange alignment of events, the births that always occurred when snow blanketed the village, as though the Lemaire family had synchronized life itself with the frozen season. Travelers passing the old house remarked on the stillness, the eerie tidiness that clashed with the decaying structure, and the faint smell of herbs burning without explanation. Priests whispered warnings, concerned by the odd rituals they glimpsed through half-closed windows, but no one dared confront the family directly. The children moved with an unnatural precision, their small bodies and faces betraying no fatigue, their eyes reflecting both fear and understanding beyond their years. Henri observed silently, horrified by the realization that these impressions were not mere obedience. They were a permanent restructuring of perception and instinct, a psychological map of control drawn with terrifying care. A local midwife, compelled by curiosity and unease, approached the house under the pretense of delivering supplies. She noticed the faint symbols etched in the cellar doorway, the unusual arrangement of candles, and the silent, watchful gaze of the children. She sensed something profoundly wrong, a rhythm that was invisible but palpable, a terror that did not announce itself with noise or violence but whispered its presence in subtle alignment and anticipation. When she returned to the village, her accounts were fragmented and uneasy, almost incoherent to those who had not witnessed the quiet orchestration of control. Villagers nodded politely but dismissed her warnings. The Lemaire household maintained the perfect mask of domestic normalcy, polite, calm, and meticulous in every detail. Even as curiosity grew, the family's methodical cruelty remained hidden, impossible to articulate to outsiders. The horrors inside were invisible, absorbed into the very instincts of the children, shaping thought and reflex, leaving no trace that could be conveyed in words. And so the Lemaire house continued its silent work, cultivating fear, obedience, and alignment in ways that the world outside could neither see nor understand, its methodical terror thriving in plain sight. The winter deepened, and the rituals inside the house grew more intricate, each detail designed to refine control over the children's bodies and minds. Henri noted the subtle shifts. Hesitation was corrected before it fully formed. Instinct replaced impulse, and even curiosity was disciplined into silent observation. Eloise and Marcel moved like unseen architects of thought, guiding each motion with precision that left no trace of fear, only quiet alignment. Outside, villagers sensed the growing strangeness, their unease mounting without understanding why. The house breathed methodically, absorbing life, shaping obedience, and embedding a terror so profound it required no words or outward cruelty to dominate all who entered its frozen threshold. Years passed, and the Lemaire house remained unchanged, a frozen monument to meticulous control and hidden horror. The children, now adults, carried the imprint of their upbringing in every thought, every movement, every instinct, a silent testament to the methodical shaping they had endured. Villagers still spoke in hushed tones of the family that gave birth only in winter, of lives that moved too precisely, smiles too measured, and eyes too watchful. Some left the village quietly, unable to reconcile the lingering dread with ordinary life, while others built their own understanding of fear based on fragments of what they had glimpsed. Over time, authorities investigated, records were unsealed, and confessions revealed a pattern so precise, so calculated, that it challenged comprehension. The rituals had been designed not to harm overtly, but to overwrite identity, to cultivate obedience and anticipation, to imprint terror as instinct. Laws were strengthened regarding child welfare and surveillance of isolated households, memorials erected to honor lives shaped and haunted in silence. Yet the philosophical shadow remained. Evil often operates not through spectacle, but through calm, deliberate planning, concealed behind normalcy, polite manners, and a tidy home. The Lemaire legacy proved that horror could thrive in subtlety, in invisible hands that shape life itself without raising a cry. As the village endured, generations learned the lesson too late. The most profound terror is often invisible, meticulous, and quiet, shaping the world beneath the veneer of everyday life. What do you think? Could this happen again?